Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jordan, and this channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. It's been quite a while since I have made a video. I apologize for that. Life just happens. Been a little bit of burnout I've been dealing with, but I'm so stoked to be bringing this video back to you. It's apropos as of this week because yesterday, August 8th, is officially the release date for the new horror film called Weapons, written and directed by Zach Cregger, who formerly did Barbarian, which I loved. I've been so excited for this film for the whole last year, especially since they dropped the first trailer. My last video was actually a reaction to the trailer. Partly what I want to do today is react to my own trailer reaction and see how many things I got right, if there was any things that I was totally off on, and just kind of comment on having now seen the movie officially in its full glory in the theater yesterday. I want to also talk about the film, how it actually went. I want to react to the actual film. And so I do want to warn you up front, this discussion is going to have a ton of spoilers. If you haven't seen the film, I would highly recommend seeing the film before watching this video. This is a film that you absolutely don't want to have spoiled. It takes you on such a wild journey. And so for that, I definitely recommend see the film before you get into this discussion. But for those of you who have seen it and want to talk more and more about this wild ride of a film, let's definitely get into it because I'm excited to talk about it. So first and foremost, I just want to say that I absolutely loved this film. This is the kind of film that I've been waiting for such a long time, especially in a theater from a studio that feels like it has the DNA of an independently made film, from the acting, writing, and character work that feels so specific and lived in and just realistic. And it feels truthful, but also the scale of the shots, the cinematography, some of the effects that happen, which are mostly practical, by the way, and certain visual effects that show up, but it feels like those are more minimal and integrated into the narrative to feel grounded. I just loved that a studio is able to put the resources behind this film to tell a great original story as well, not based off anything, but give it the resources it needed to still make an incredibly adult but well-grounded horror film that felt in a lot of ways almost more like a psychological drama. That's totally my cup of tea personally. I love horror films that still feel very realistic as far as everything that happens in them. There is a slight touch of the supernatural within this movie, but the thing that I liked about it is when they were touching it, it still felt very realistic and grounded. They didn't go off into this really wild supernatural realm where there's a lot of visual effects that all of a sudden pop in. It all felt like things that realistically could and would happen. Pretty much everything felt very practical and captured on location with real people, with real props and effects. That is something I loved so much. I think that's something that a lot of audiences, aside from myself, really are craving in our modern day filmmaking, especially because we've seen what happens when you can tip the scale and go way over the top with visual effects, and how it just doesn't feel realistic anymore. We can feel that they're acting on a green screen stage, and that just takes me out of the movie personally as a viewer, but also as a filmmaker myself. I'm very much a stickler on that. This is one thing that I think Weapons and the whole team and Zach Cregger did such a great job of. One thing I want to note here is that this is a perfect example of the type of film that we haven't really seen in the marketplace, what I would call the mid-budget studio film. What I mean by that is any type of film that's made by a studio, predominantly financed and distributed, oftentimes marketed as well, but a film that lives anywhere between the $20 million to $60 million budget range. That's really what I would classify in 2025 as the mid-budget studio film. And so I think we see other really great examples of films like this in the early 2000s in films such as the American remake of The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski. That movie, I believe, was made for about $40 million in 2002, which would have been even more money if you were to adjust for inflation. But that to me is something I love, because with that budget range, you have enough budget to pull off a certain amount of spectacle, stunts, effects, VFX, etc. However, you don't have enough to pull off the kind of spectacle and scale and the amount of visual effects shots that you would see in something like a Marvel film, which is usually in the $100 to $200 million budget range, if not more. So for me, I love that this is such a unique parameter that causes a filmmaker to have to really get specific about the character, the story, and they have to tell a good story that is mostly grounded with the flair and enough dazzling effects that keep us coming back for more as a viewer. To me, this is really that perfect budget range I wish more studios and filmmakers had the ability to operate in. But in the horror genre right now, this seems to be really the only genre that's getting not only original films, but is getting the proper support from a studio level. And I think other filmmakers that are getting this luxury, in addition to Cregger, is Jordan Peele's a perfect example. With after Get Out, he was able to do Us. That was around $30 million. Same with Robert Eggers, who is also doing incredible work at the $50 and above million budget ranges that are in the horror, but also historical genres, as his stuff is always taking place in a different time and place, which is also a unique factor for him as well. But anyway, I loved that this film really capitalized off its budget. I think it was made for $38 million, and that is such a perfect budget range, and I think they made every single dollar really shine on screen in the best way. They shot this film in Atlanta. I love how much of this film is completely shot on location. In fact, I would say a large majority of this film is shot in exteriors, so neighborhood streets, outside the school, outside parks, outside police stations. You're really getting a good feel for the community, and it feels like suburban America. And I love that you really get such a good idea of the world of this story that feels like modern day America in maybe a smaller community where people know each other, the kids all go to the same school, but it's also big enough that there are chances for evil new things to lurk in the shadows and in the woods, and I think Atlanta provides that perfect backdrop for this film. The other thing I really love is the camera work in this film. I really want to talk about how fluid and dynamic the camera movement is throughout this whole film. Almost every single shot in the film is moving. It's either a really quick dolly shot or a lateral tracking shot. There's obviously a lot of kids and people that are running throughout the film, and I think as a result the camera has to move to that same degree to be able to capture the kids moving dynamically. But also I'm really impressed with the editing between shots. Whenever they would cut between one moving shot to another tracking shot, it felt very seamless and very well designed just from a shot listing standpoint. Larkin Seipel is the cinematographer on this movie, and I just thought he did a great job of capturing the film in a way that felt very grounded from a lighting standpoint and very naturalistic, but with a touch of artistic flair. So it never feels like it totally goes beyond the realm of how something would actually look in the real world from a motivated lighting standpoint. And to me, I think that really borrows from the type of independent film. Obviously, Magnolia by Paul Thomas Anderson is a big reference on this. Zach Cregger said that many times. I addressed that in the trailer video. That's the last video I did. And I think you really see that from a camera movement standpoint. But also I think you see it from the structural design of the film in terms of we're telling it from many different characters, and each character almost gets their own chapter as if in a novel. And I think that's cool because the characters all have their stories intersecting, and the way in which they intersect at the certain times always kind of picks up right around when one is ending in one chapter. We're sort of picking off another character and following them and getting a better feel for not only who they are as a character. So what this does is it fragments the narrative in an interesting way, and it also keeps us engaged in the characters because this is a really good device for giving us character exposition and a good reason to get to know these characters when we enter their respective chapter. I think this is just a very cool novelistic approach. I love when shows do this. I think Euphoria does this very well in the first season. When it has a new episode introduce each new character, it really gives us a reason to go into the exposition in an organic way that's not too exposition heavy. So I really love that. And we also get to establish each character's unique persona and what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And I think we really feel for an ensemble film like this, like nobody's story really completely usurps anyone else's. I was convinced going into this that Julia Garner was going to get by far more screen time than I think she actually ended up getting in the final film. That was one of the predictions that I think I was making and I thought about from my last trailer reaction. And even same with Josh Brolin's character, Archer, who plays the father of one of the missing children that goes missing at the very beginning of the film. I just really thought it was interesting how we really do get the proper time with all of these other characters. So it feels very balanced, and it really isn't clear whose story this actually really is. And I love that. I think too often we always follow a protagonist and it's their story that we're kind of following this whole narrative through, which makes sense, and I think that works. But in a story like this, it almost feels like a fairy tale or an urban legend or a myth. A lot of people have said that it almost resembles sort of the Pied Piper kind of archetypal story, and I think that's very true when we eventually get into meeting Gladys, who's the sort of the ultimate antagonist in this film. film, who kind of comes in late into the game and establishes that she's sort of this supernatural witch-like character that has these supernatural abilities where she's able to conjure people. She has to feed off other people's life forces. I think she's also a really great character. Amy Madigan plays Gladys, and I didn't even really recognize her in the role. To be honest, I wasn't very familiar with Amy Madigan, but her performance in this was just electric. She definitely moves between being so incredibly creepy and almost clown-like and silly to being icy, cold, calculated, terrifying, and intimidating in the same breath and within the same scene within the span of a couple moments, and it feels believable. It doesn't feel over the top. And when they do a couple close-ups on her in this film, I saw it also in an IMAX theater, and I was closer to the screen. It was absolutely terrifying. I mean, it totally unnerved me, but you see the depth of her performance is fantastic, in her eyes and her facial expressions and every moment of what she's doing. So Amy Madigan, you crushed it. To be honest, every actor in this film really crushed it. I loved also that we got a chance to have these character moments that felt so realistic. So for example, there's scenes where there's a lot of humor that comes about, but not because they're trying to write a joke into the scene. It's because the absurdity of what the characters are going through in certain moments sometimes are just so absurd. Oh, I got a little hair there. Let me get that. But some of the situations that happen in the movie are so absurd, the characters can't help but almost comment on that, which to me feels pretty realistic and it feels human, but it allows these characters to exercise a bit of the comedy chops amongst what would mostly be a dramatic story through and through. So I think it really requires the actors to have those dramatic chops, but also have the touch of comedy in a way that feels organic and earned, though. So I love that about the tone of this film. And one thing I really enjoyed was that the pacing never lets up. Right when you might feel like it could potentially come to a point where the momentum could grind to a halt, it never does. They cut to another character's chapter. And I also think that is partly one of the smart things about the design of the film and the screenplay, is that once we understand the conceit of that each character is going to get their own chapter with a title at the beginning, then we all start to get excited in the audience about, well, who else are we going to follow? What else is going on with these other characters, and what is their story, and how do they connect to what's going on in this small town? I think that's such a smart plot device, and I think Magnolia did elements of it, though slightly differently, and I think that's where that Magnolia influence is a smart way to juggle an ensemble. And it's no surprise that in the way that Magnolia juggled an ensemble of many characters that all came together and felt balanced in doing so, this film does a great job balancing its ensemble as well. So it's really more of an ensemble piece than a character-driven, singular protagonist-driven piece. We almost end up realizing that Julia Garner is not necessarily the protagonist. She just happens to be the teacher of the class where all these kids went missing the night at 2:17 a.m. when they went missing. One thing I wanted to note is, interestingly enough, I was commenting on how well the first teaser trailer was edited, and this is in no way to take any credit away from the company who ended up editing that thing. But what's interesting is the very first couple minutes of the actual film are basically beat for beat what the first teaser trailer is that we covered in the first video. So when I was in the theater, for a second, I almost thought they'd messed up and played the teaser trailer for Weapons instead of the actual movie. And then I realized there were a couple shots throughout that first 2 minutes that are longer that they trimmed down for the sake of the rhythm and pacing for the teaser. I found that very interesting. I don't know if I've ever seen that before, where the first 2 minutes are almost like its own mini introduction to the film. And there's really no dialogue in that section aside from the kid narrator, who's absolutely amazing. Forgetting what her name is, she never actually shows up in the film itself beyond just being the kid narrator. She is absolutely fantastic.
This is a true story that happened in my town. So this one Wednesday is like a normal day for the whole school. But today was different.
And what I love is her voice is the only one speaking. None of the other characters, we don't hear them speak until multiple minutes into the film, where our real narrative kind of picks up. And so I really like that first whole intro is its own mini introduction and movie, in the same way that Magnolia basically does the same thing with a narrator to set up the story.
17-year-old Sydney Barringer in the city of Los Angeles on March 23rd, 1958.
It's a very smart way to give us a setup for the plot very quickly. It sets up all the kids left their homes, cuts us to black, and then it actually lets us start the movie by picking up from Miss Gandy's perspective, played by Julia Garner, who's the teacher. And I like how much more depth they gave to her character than I was expecting at first glance from the teaser. The other thing I really enjoyed was the music. Music really supports this mysterious kind of feel where it makes you feel like something is going on, it creeps along, but it sort of hints that we don't really have the full scope of information.
Every other class had all their kids. But Mrs. Gandy's room...
I don't know if there's a better way to describe what that kind of score sounds like that happens in this movie, but to me it just sounds like a quintessential mystery film type of score. And that's the extent of my music knowledge. My apologies. But another thing that I particularly enjoyed about this film is there are flashes of intense violence, but to me it never felt gratuitous. It felt like it worked in service of the story. And I think there are certain moments where Gladys gets torn apart by the kids when they finally are conjured by Alex, who ends up becoming the only kid who is not the one who disappears with the group of kids when they go out at night. When he ends up conjuring the kids on her, not only does that feel like a good payoff, but when they disintegrate her and it gets really violent and bloody, to me it feels earned, and it's only because it's splashes of intense violence that still really never go on longer than I think they need to. In 2025, I think audiences within horror films want splashes of that more edgy content. Films like The Substance that really go there way further than I think anything in this movie does. But I think audiences are more primed for that, and obviously if you're going to see a movie like this, I think you have to understand there could be certain elements of intense violence because that's sort of just what is cultivated within a lot of the horror films we see right now. I'm not saying that's a great thing or a bad thing, it just sort of is the current trend that we see. Another thing I really liked about this film is how often we are moving, whether the characters are running, the creepy pose that they have, which I think is just a great visual design for how they're running. But I also think the constant use of characters in cars, there's so many shots of characters who are speeding in cars, flying around the city, whether they're pursuing someone or they're en route to get somewhere in a hurry, or they spot somebody and then they flip around. There's a lot of great shots where we're in the car and we get a really quick U-turn, or we get characters like the cop who's flying through the city, and we get these great lateral tracking shots of characters running across parallel when he's in pursuit of the druggie, played by Austin Abrams, who did a great job playing the druggie, well cast as well. He just looks like he'd be a druggie. But I love how much urgency it felt like there was to the film, with the shots of the characters constantly in motion. And to me, I really think that's a very satisfying shooting and editing rhythm that audiences really like to see. It just feels good when you have a great tracking shot cut into another great tracking shot and they're executed so seamlessly. It feels like the energy of an audience member sometimes rises and falls based off how much kinetic energy we're getting on screen. I really believe that. And I think obviously there still has to be a service to it in service of the story. It still has to be working for us. But some of these shots work so incredibly well, and because the camera really never stops moving, we feel this sense of propulsive action where I don't think for a second I ever felt bored or like the momentum of the film had stopped. I constantly wanted to keep knowing what was going on, and part of that really is the service of the camera work in this film, which I think is excellent. I'm a big fan of quicker tracking shots myself. I think you see a little bit of Shining influence here as well, which again was another big reference on this film that Zach Cregger has said in interviews. But I think the reason the Shining works so well with the visual design of that film is the same thing. There's so many great long tracking shots where we use a wide lens. When you use a wide lens, things fly by the camera a lot faster and it accentuates the space in a much wider way. It exaggerates the space. So when you throw a wide lens on a camera and you have a quick steady cam or a tracking shot, it just looks visually appealing. It makes us feel excited. It makes us feel like we're flying through the scene at the same speed these characters are. And so that's one thing I particularly liked and stood out to me is kinetic energy in this film is on fire. And I think that always just works for audiences. I think I've talked about this in other YouTube videos, but this film is a perfect example of how I think it works super well when it's working well. As far as my only real gripes with the film that I would say, and again, these are smaller gripes because this really is the kind of film that I would be so proud to have made if it was my film. This is the kind of film I think we've been yearning for a long time because it has the DNA of films that were made in the 90s and the early 2000s, but it's made for the modern day with contemporary lens on things, and it still has an indie flourish, but it also has the spectacle and scale of a studio film. film. And I think more and more audiences want original films that have the combinations of both of these things, which really is to say the studio films of yesteryear. We just want the great studio films that still had great drama and great character work, that don't necessarily have a 10th installment of a franchise that's gotten way too tired, needs to be extinct. I'm talking about you, Jurassic Park, that needs to stop making entries. I'm talking about you, Marvel. The thing is, we want something fresh and new. Not only did Barbarian do that very well, but I also think Weapons took that to an entirely different level and scale. And so I'm excited to see what else Cregger has up his sleeve. I know his next movie actually is IP. It's the Resident Evil movie based off the video games, which I am excited to see because I like that world. But when he goes back to his next original film, I'll be completely enthralled to see what he does, and I'll bet you he'll get even more stars and budget when he's able to do that. So that will be exciting. But as far as the only gripes that I did have for the film, which I didn't have many, I think certain symbolic themes that he was tapping into, namely intergenerational trauma and kids that are having to deal with trauma from their own families or upbringings or parents, or the school shooting motif or the gun violence theme, especially in elementary schools and schools throughout America. I do wish he would have pushed that further. I think there's a very real commentary there that's not only terrifying and heartbreaking, but very realistic and still pertinent in America in 2025. It's insane to me that this is something that still happens with so much regularity. Whenever we hear about in the news, it almost feels like, oh, another one. They've become standard place for our culture, which is just completely ridiculous and completely unacceptable. But I do wish that the prevalence of gun violence, especially in schools in America, there was one small allusion to it with the image of the AK-47 over the house in Josh Brolin's dream early in the film. I just wish they would have done a little more with that, or not shown that image at all, because by showing that, there's a very small hint at he's gonna address that throughout the movie, and there's gonna be more of a theme for that being something they're really going to speak to, and then it never ever is addressed ever again throughout the film. It almost feels like a fluke, like it shouldn't have necessarily even been in the film. That's just my opinion, but who knows, maybe there was something else he was trying to say there, he just didn't quite say it, or he wanted the audience to interpret it on their own. I just wish he would have pushed that a step further, to be quite honest with you. I also think there's a metaphor that could have been connected, where with all the children that left that night, there could have been a tie-in where those kids all maybe aren't here anymore. There is one who survived, and he has this survivor's guilt. Maybe that would have been too dark of an angle to take and not marketable as a studio film theatrically, but to me that would have been very, very poignant and hit hard, and would have really addressed an incredibly real issue that we still see, and is such a political issue that I think could have been tackled. But maybe that's just my input, that's my standpoint. The other thing is, there was sort of this element that I saw Zach Cregger had hinted at. His father was an alcoholic who passed away, unfortunately, and Zach Cregger was an alcoholic for a while. He's been sober 10 years. And part of the metaphor, when Gladys, the aunt, comes in and she sort of takes over, and the parents all of a sudden fall into this stupor, and the kid almost has to now start taking care of them and become the adult. The metaphor there is sort of what alcoholism can do to a family by making the parents feel, or a parent feel, completely useless, or more like a puppet or a slave to the alcohol, and the kid almost has to step up and take care of them. But I wish there was a little bit more of a step taken further in that, just to kind of illuminate that this is a theme that we're speaking to. Sometimes I think it is okay to make a theme a little more clear within the story if you're going to make a commentary about a certain societal issue. Sometimes I think you do got to make it a little bit more clear, this is what you're addressing. That way people, I think, know what you're talking about. Some filmmakers might disagree with me. That's my preference. As a viewer, I kind of like to give me a little bit more, and then you can still keep it vague after, and I can solve certain things on my own. But sometimes I think we need a little bit of extra push there, if you know what I mean. But one thing that I think I really do enjoy, going back to my trailer reaction, is a lot of what I commented on with the quick use of dollies, the editing, pacing, the talent of the girl who does the voiceover, who's just phenomenal. I really do think that the film matches and lives up to, if not exceeds, what kind of film we were getting set up to watch in the teaser trailer. I love that. I really don't love when a film mismarkets to a high degree what the film actually ends up being in the final product. product. Sometimes I think that can be effective and surprising, but in some cases I almost think we feel disappointed or cheated if it was marketed to be a certain thing and then it totally turns out to be a completely different film. So I loved that really the film that they set it up to be, I think it was very accurate and spot on for the film that not only was I looking for, but the film that I think they're selling us on. So I do think this is a testament to the marketing, not giving too much away, but also setting up what this movie actually looks and feels like. And it delivered on every element of the premise that I think it should have. Some people might argue the third act and some of the motivations of the actual villain and Gladys coming into town aren't quite as developed as well. That might be one of my other small critiques, is we don't ever really get a sense of how she got her supernatural powers, where it came from, why she decided then to kind of come to the town and focus on Alex's parents. We don't really ever get much of that. I don't necessarily know if the movie absolutely needs it, but I think those are things that to me would be interesting to know. I don't know if that means there is a sequel that you could address some of that in. Do you think, just for a thought experiment, if you were to take this and make it into a limited series, which they probably won't, but if they were to, that is where I do think you could have the format where every episode could take the novelistic approach and focus on a different character, and you could have a whole hour to flesh out a character instead of 10 or 15 minutes like a little mini movie within the feature structure. But it's tough because you only have so much time, and some of that again just doesn't end up being completely relevant. I think this is an interesting film to categorize because it's partly horror, there's some shock factor, but it's also very much a psychological thriller. It's kind of a mystery drama, but I think it checks all the boxes of things that I really find interesting, and it just does a lot of these things very well. I think the humor lands when it needs to. I think it's surprising, and you really are never a step ahead of the plot where it's going. I love that about this film, is they set up these kids went missing, which is a great setup on its own. It feels more like old school traditional storytelling that we don't see a lot of as much, and it didn't have to rely on this elaborate or very contrived type of plot. This is a plot that I think anyone who hears it's like, oh, where'd the kids go? And why did only one kid stay in the classroom? It asks all these really great questions. And one of the things that I've heard about Zach Cregger's writing process that I respect, because I've never been able to do this myself as a writer, but maybe I'll try, is it seems like when he approaches his scripts, from interviews I've read, including Barbarian, he did this too, he just goes blank page, he dives in, and he just thinks of one line that starts it out. He almost doesn't even outline, it seems. He just goes with the flow, sees where the energy takes him, and he follows the thread of what questions keep popping up and what would be the potential answers to those questions that are interesting. So for example, I think I read that for Weapons, the first line he had was, okay, a kid's narrating a story about a small town, and the kid's first line is,
"This is a true story that happened in my town."
and then the next line was,
Every other class had all their kids, but Mrs. Gandy's room was totally empty.
and then in his brain, he asked the question, okay, well, where'd they go? Okay, well, why did they go there? How is the rest of the town going to react to it? What are they going to do to solve it? It's a really good way of just sort of organically following a thread, which is basically what a storytelling device is. The one thing about outlining is sometimes you can outline yourself to death, and then sometimes it almost can kill some of that freshness. But overall, I think this is an incredibly well done film. I'm so happy that it is getting the rave reviews that it's getting, the cultural impact. I truly hope that this film does incredible numbers at the box office, because what that will do is show through people's actions and spending that as viewers, we want more original and interesting and compelling stories that are in the mid-budget range like this film. It really checks all those boxes, and I think this is really the kind of film that a lot more people are craving in the marketplace, even if they don't necessarily vocalize it or know what that looks like. I think when we see it, we know it, and it creates a cultural conversation. And again, this is also, it's a New Line Cinema, which is a branch of Warner Brothers. This is a Warner Brothers film, so Warner Brothers is 2 for 2. Sinners was amazing, also original, did huge numbers at the box office, and Weapons hopefully is on track to do the same. Truly, say what you want about what's happening at Warner Discovery, their motion picture group is putting out interesting and original films, and I think that's something that we should applaud and continue to champion. So that's my plea. I'm very proud of what they're doing. One day I will be directing a Warner Brothers film. You've heard that right here, right now. So I'm just putting it out there and manifesting it to the universe. Overall, I just want to say this film is incredible. Highly recommend it if you have not seen it yet. Again, if you're watching this and you haven't seen it, what are you doing? But if you have any other comments or takes, or if you think my analysis was pretty spot on, leave a comment below. If you didn't, I'd also love to see a comment below. Let me know if you have any other interpretations as well about the AK-47 or the angle about the kids going missing, or if you find any other metaphor or symbolism throughout the film that you noticed that really spoke to you. Put them in the comments below. I'd love to have a deeper discussion. I'd also love to hear what you think about weapons if you've seen it, and we can talk more about that. But until then, I really appreciate you watching and tuning in. Can't wait to hear more of your theories about weapons and what the symbolism really means to you. Congrats to Zach Cregger and the entire cast and crew of Weapons. Very proud this film is out there in the world. I loved it. I'm gonna see it multiple times. Let me know if there's any other films you want me to do reviews for or trailers. I'll definitely check them out. I'd be happy to do it. So thank you again as always for tuning in. I really appreciate your support. It means the world to me, and I will definitely catch you next time.
This is where the story really starts.